Lama Dangum Bonjambe Mazaza Loi, Gungelo Denye Denye Trananda Sarave, Chinye Dun, Chichen Zizrene Tukra Levonaze, Kunda Sebe, Zunra Mare, Mentan Dunga Chezeve, Rozoi Gunlai Puje Tarze, Yen Lai Toje Yonden Song. Rudra Chedro Nyamo Nilon Leje Chadron Ronzejen Mare Mesre Dungra Nyugu Jinye Junze Radrenam Dene Tajin Saju Tarsun Yenten Luzo Jase Tubuku Chundra Chudon Chunye Jent Dale Mesen Chambe Yon La Zeden Cheche Chiro Vesreje Talu Demo Membara Srane Guadon Denju Junglu Tokwa Ye Luju Pope Nongwa Zaldu Soro Gange Tuji Zerje Tawa Tamje Nambomba Tenjen De Nyong Tunba Kong Kodam De La Daja Chal Topi Chawa Nam Zerje Sadwan Jache Vesreda Gundu Zombe Sereda Gunne Cholang Sha Chal Jamya Shana Durje Jenreze Sayin Bo Drivan Nam Brase Nam Kenyin Bo Pakcho Gundu Zon Nyewe Seshin Jela Sha Chalo Dagserap Gundo Drivela, Dusum Jarwa Gunje Chenama, Gazar Shachi Shani Nuja Para Yomjuru Burnamla Sha Lo, Serap Gundo Siji Tani Le, Tanke Sam, Shagi Yong Zonshi, Sanjum Yimbu Lam Ken Karma Ba, Mishede, Chivu Zuge Du Lasso, Ta, I do delay.
So, Khenpo Rinpoche wishes everyone a good morning.
Tene, ta kasang ge chöne mutu de ma yasalani gene shugi.
And the explanations today are a continuation of the previous topics or topic, which concerns a text named the 37 practices of a Bodhisattva, or simply what a Bodhisattva does.
Tati cheyong tu ta kasang partu tene yasalani sodem di tenja zo drabote yase lani sodem asinkin degi tenja zote 당보 토몽그 남람지 송제버래 배시 쇼로그 주정아지 인정아지 임바요 다단데 쇼로그 장가든 양에 마송 되네 디예네 토몽 마인 배송집 셈베게 람긴념네 자르던제버래
Now in terms of the text and its topic, the first few verses or shlokas set forth explanations that concern both Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism. The remaining verses then set forth the path of a Bodhisattva, which is specific to Mahayana Buddhism.
Penna jebu sumge lamgan rotang de jarne shuna yang tangbo jebu chungyu samna tang tang de rangyu la maje tammeba jimbate.
So if one considers this in the context of the paths practiced by individuals of the three capacities, lower, middling and greater, one should understand that any given practitioner would need to go through all 3 levels. One starts out with the lower level, the path of those of a lower capacity, till one has achieved skill in that context, and then one will go on to the second level, because it is necessary that any given practitioner goes through all 3 levels.
Penandi Tange Chibu Drain the Chembu Lam Yamnenchi Gona Rang Toma Dene Milu Yang Tapaji Tobie Danjur Jobje than them by Milici.
Sikti Kogin do that Drotan the class
Drotan the Penna Chibun Drain Tang.
Yeah, that pay Shikshana.
Penna Nirangi Lamjin Yamnen Tang. Teaching Lamjin Yamnen Che Gona.
Och Nyenrangi Nyamlen Pachik, Tekchingi Nyamlen Che Gona.
Tanjur Ge Luigi Top Gogre Mato, Di Nyamlen Che to be at the Kaburi. Chesan Che Chung Nicha.
Point made is, for example, a practitioner of both Theravada Buddhism and a practitioner of Theravada Buddhism and a practitioner of Mahayana Buddhism, in order to be able for either of them to practice the Buddhist path at whatever level, they need to begin with obtain a so-called free and well-favored human rebirth. A rebirth where they have the conditions necessary for practicing any of the Buddhist paths, as well as the personal capacity to do so. So anyone wanting to practice Buddhism at all, no matter what the division of Buddhism that one practices, need to begin with obtaining a free and well-favored human rebirth.
Today in the Tanjur Lutopande Kalbas Zangbi Bachik Maran Shet Viajitan Teyang Judegi Nesu Shenkinch Jugewa Shepard Tene Deva Tanjur Lutopioba Megawa Shenang in Sonsom Roger, what things to put it levicheto, then Tanjurin Yekat on Landeg 2 days, Songdua.
So a person who has obtained a so-called free and well-favored human rebirth in this life should know that this is something rare, and that he is exceedingly fortunate in having obtained that kind of rebirth, which would involve this person understanding that virtuous actions will, by way of engaging or having engaged in virtue in the past, these virtuous actions have brought about the fortune of a free and well-favored human rebirth in this life. And this person also understands that the opposite, namely non-virtuous actions, result in unfortunate rebirths, such as a rebirth in any of the three lower existences. So, when one speaks of being fortunate here, one speaks of what has been obtained right now in this lifetime, namely a free and well-favored human rebirth, and that this has been obtained in effect of having engaged in virtue and given up non-virtue.
Tinde penangaranso 단절기 루텐지 톱요래 tene yenayang tan namba sanje goru shuju chungare yenayang maung pana 단절 루텐 푼좀 속바지 톱톱them medu sikete 단단가랑 샤웨 되네 삼나당 예르와.
Furthermore, one should understand, having entered the Buddhist path in this life, in consequence of having obtained a free and well-favored human rebirth, that for this to happen in the future, for such rebirth to be obtained in the future, it is necessary that one in this life makes good use of this good rebirth, primarily by way of practicing virtue. Maungpa tope chetu.
Maungpa topdom mitopte.
Yeah.
Tanda lelra leverba.
Because whether this opportunity will be one that one obtains in one or more future rebirths depends upon the nature of one's actions in this life.
Tiyinde pena chene nima tringa partu rang kharchendo nima rere yindu tim matam nayang che samare tananda lo dawa tringirawa te chene le gewa chi santuna ngone rang gawa gam.
So one should take a look at how one has spent one's life. This is very important in order to have a good understanding of the need for present virtuous actions as well. One can't just sit back and think of this good rebirth as having been obtained without considering the fact that one needs to engage in virtuous actions right now for that to happen again in another rebirth. So one should look back in terms of how one has spent this life. Of course, one can't remember each and everything or each and every action one has engaged in since birth, as it were. However, in general, one would know when looking back whether one has primarily in this life acted in a virtuous manner or not. It is very important to maintain an awareness of this in the present, and if one finds that one has primarily acted in a virtuous manner in this life, one should rejoice in that fact. on the other hand, if one finds that perhaps one has engaged in quite a lot of non-virtuous actions in this life, one should acknowledge that and regret the previous non-virtuous actions and pledge to stop acting in this manner. One pledges to give up non-virtuous actions.
Tene ta tenje gene jebu chungge ta sama tang de rang gyura ngepan rong jejuk ti ye
Karen ngepan rong
jebu chungge sama tang te danjo nyeka tang lende ge chula sama tang ne.
So in this way, one should, in this life, contemplate or give thought to or simply practice the advice given to those who engage in the first of the three levels listed earlier, the lower level, that path. One should foster the mindset of that path, the mindset of practitioners of a lower capacity, and give thought to what a free and well-favored human rebirth is about, in terms of how one can obtain that kind of rebirth and so on. One should also give thought to the workings of cause and effect, the law of karma. And contemplate what a worldly existence in the end is about, namely suffering. One should foster an understanding of that. A worldly existence, though things at times may seem pleasant, even those pleasant circumstances are of the nature of suffering. In terms of understanding suffering, most people take as their object actual suffering, manifest suffering, and label that circumstance or situation as one of suffering.
Remnek nargi yorwa. Remge nasaka nardo ho 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 ta pemsu tupore rogundo re mama sen ngaran changme sedegi.
Now, throughout our world right now, there is the COVID pandemic, and all people everywhere in our world see this pandemic as a situation of suffering.
The suffering te one cover in remato, whatever kayang. Me, Korang Chunire Mato COVID-19 de mixer ge tenedungal tebaji kayang.
However, if one looks at that viewpoint, as it were, of suffering, it's a rather limited viewpoint which doesn't understand suffering at large, as it were. It focuses on evident suffering and sees that as suffering. At something unusual and specific that has happened and will last for a period of time. and then come to an end. However, worldly existence is such that suffering is present all the time in the context of various levels of existence and in the context of what's happening, like this event of the present pandemic. In fact, samsara, or a worldly existence, is such that there is always suffering, like the one in connection with the pandemic. It's not something unusual, exceptional, or extraordinary. The nature of worldly existence is such that various types of suffering surface one after the other. So the event of the present pandemic is not some sort of isolated occurrence that has happened and now for a while everything is awful till the pandemic ends. After that pandemic ends, there will be, and there are right now, other situations of suffering. This is not the one and only, as it were. So once one is reborn in a worldly existence, that means suffering, because the very nature of any worldly existence is suffering. Consider the fact that once born, one will have to face the suffering of aging. It's just the nature of a worldly existence. This is a type of suffering that no one can avoid, or that does not happen to some individuals and not others. It happens to all individuals born in a worldly existence. Also, once born, there will be episodes of disease. No one can escape disease. So, this present pandemic is just one of the possible diseases that can happen in a worldly existence. There are so many other diseases that happen right now and will continue to happen because of suffering being the nature of worldly existence. Worldly existence is, as it were, made up of suffering. Its substance, as it were, its very nature. Also, any individual born in a worldly existence will have to face death one day, and the suffering facing death involves. No one can escape this, because this is the nature of a worldly existence. This is the stuff that worldly existence is made up of. Some individuals in the present face death because of COVID-19. Some individuals in the present face death because of tuberculosis or any other disease, because this is what worldly existence is about, suffering in various shapes and forms. It's as simple as that.
단다야 송진바레 마음바나 송예바.
So, in all one's previous rebirths, one has undergone all of these types of suffering. One does in one's present life, and one will in future lives, because this is the stuff that worldly existence is made up of. Worldly existence is suffering.
And
this is the mindset that is fostered by practitioners on the lower of the 3 levels listed. Then you have the middling level, where practitioners have fostered that mindset just described in brief, and therefore has the foundation for being able to practice the middling level. And here the mindset fostered is the mindset which has understood what was explained, namely that worldly existence is made up of suffering, and therefore the practitioner understands and takes as his focus the importance of freeing himself from the shackles of worldly suffering, focusing therefore on obtaining liberation from suffering. And here we find the second path, that of the middling level, which is that of Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, Theravada Buddhism. Then we have the third and higher level, where practitioners are said to be of a higher or supreme capacity. Practitioners here have fostered and achieved, as it were, the mindsets of the 2 previous levels, and therefore they have the foundation which makes it possible for them to practice the highest of the 3 levels, where the primary focus is that of the welfare of all other sentient beings who are trapped in worldly existences. And here compassion for those trapped in worldly existences is the main feature. And that concerns the path of a bodhisattva, and a bodhisattva is an individual who has achieved the mindset of the 3rd level, as well as the mindsets of the 2 previous levels, of course. And this type of person is referred to as a bodhisattva, the type of person who has cultivated and achieved all 3 mindsets.
Tanya did something Rigamarwa.
However, this word, Bodhisattva, is then the name of such an individual, but to be a Bodhisattva in name only isn't sufficient, as it were.
Perna go there was Shushavina. Purg looks like Turkus in Yarva.
Now, to take an example that would be easy to understand, perhaps, in terms of what this means, consider the Tibetan Buddhist tradition of reincarnated masters, individuals who are seen as individuals who have reincarnated for the sake of benefiting others in general.
Yena ti Turku se Tanya del Tanya re Tigis Turku Shawach Machena Turku one Chagyo.
So in Tibetan this is called Turku. Probably all of you who have been around in Tibetan Buddhism for a while are familiar with the name Tulku or the title Tulku. Now, here the same applies. A Tulku is recognized as the reincarnation of a master. Of course, when one speaks of a master, you again have various levels of accomplishment. All tulkus are not at the same level, as it were. There is a wide range of levels in terms of how far they have come on the path to enlightenment. However, in general, there is this name, title, tulku. And it's attributed to someone in effect of that someone having been recognized by a high-level master as the reincarnation of so-and-so. So, from an early age, a tulku is given the name title tulku. Now, that doesn't mean that the individual in question automatically acts the way the previous master did. He has just been given the name title Tulku. Then how he develops in this life depends upon his actions in this life. From an early age, he is a tulku in name only, as it were. And unless the tulku in question acts in accordance with the master he's said to be a reincarnation of, then not much progress could be made in that life.
Penna tila kavasimbo kontong jambe yang song ji yor. Jambe yang. Kar song yor sana. Turku sengejege te tanye te pög luxurious. Ko yawa ji re segi yor. Ko turku Turku te ngoma ina songte. Turku imbe lakje ji gore songte. Lakje sina sheje ji gore songte.
Chevadilla,
Chevadilla. Lame Jewari said, Kaki Pingamatis, Lagich Goddess.
Min Kangpagi, Korang Tandagi Keva Digi Ringla, da Chava Ke Parva, then the chick. Tenmatur na tenne da ka. Tenmasong Ming Remato.
Kake Pingamares. Shawa Cheparwatik.
Lasso?
Kari Yoresna. Randun to Sam Gamsum Teres. Töpa.
Yeah, Deda, Sam Gomsum. Deda Kalamin.
Yendun to Shedrup Ni Gishawach Gogres.
Shedrup Ni Gichama.
They mena for Sunday reason.
De Mina?
They mena Sunday reason.
Sandra City?
Mingo Janjang to Janja Sanking is Sunday reason. What the sick penny chongo beja tangar. Mingo Janja, down there is Sunday Moma Tati reason. Petin as you day. Naranza Sanchip sempre damba shu. Sanchip sempre che.
Dompa shu, tene?
Shu, jig shu, ni shu, some shu, water, you the Sanchip sempre ready sugar. Yin na yang, Sanchip sempre churnam to Manjuna, take Nanzakune on the Zenging of Matichak.
There, Dira, Kari Guntang Jampea.
Condon Jambe young in the summer.
Dira Kangi Gela shootere. Con Dira.
To drop the page, job Jänner is a large.
There is a very well known Tibetan Buddhist master. In specific, renowned as a great scholar as to the Buddha's doctrine, by the name Gungtang Jampalyang. Now, he said the following regarding the topic Tulku, or the name title Tulku, in terms of its ramifications. Gungtang Jampalyang said, there is the tradition of tulkus in Tibetan Buddhism, and a tulku is presumably the rebirth of a deceased master or practitioner, accomplished practitioner. Now, if the individual who has been appointed, as it were, or recognized, appointed as a tulku, or recognized as a tulku, as it were, is the real thing, as it were. If the tulku in question truly is the reincarnation of so and so, then that would become evident through the tulku's actions in this life. If the tulku in question does not engage in the actions of a tulku in terms of the tulku system, then no benefit will be derived in terms of that individual. There are specific actions or a specific lifestyle, as it were, that a true tulku would engage in. And here you have two perspectives. A true tulku who is a true tulku simply because he truly is the rebirth of the previous master that he's said to be the reincarnation of. There are two perspectives. It's the perspective of the personal development of the tulku. And here a true tulku would focus on studies, contemplation and meditation. These are the actions that it would be naturally to engage in for a true tulku. His personal lifestyle or his interest in this life would be actions in the context of studying the Buddha's doctrine, contemplating the deeper meaning of what has been studied, and then translate that into the practice of meditation, as it were. A true tulku would, if he truly is the reincarnation of his predecessor, quite naturally choose that lifestyle. Then there is the second perspective. Then there is the second perspective, that of what the tulku does for the sake of benefiting others. And that would involve establishing the Shepadan Dropa, Korang Mi Shen La She, Tene Rang, Tene Yang Drup, Tene De Drupe Menga Dang Hangina. That would involve giving Buddhist education to others, as it were, namely teaching the Buddha's doctrine to others in order to enlighten them about the Buddha's doctrine, as well as giving transmissions in terms of meditation practice, explanations, guidance, and so on, enabling practitioners to practice Buddhist meditation. These are the two main actions in terms of other individuals that a true tulku would engage in this life. Now, this is what Guntang Jampel explained in terms of the tulku system, on the basis of what one can recognize a true tulku, what he referred to as a true tulku. If this isn't applicable, he said, to an individual with this name title, the name title tulku, then that person is simply a charlatan who confuses others and in doing so make a good living for himself. This is what one here in the West would refer to as a bad person. The literal translation of the Tibetan here is rather even stronger. Bad person is sort of
nice.
A nice way of putting it. So this is how this recent Tibetan Buddhist master explained how one in general can see if an individual who has the name title tulku in terms of whether this person is a true tulku or not. Now, the same applies to all individuals who have taken the Bodhisattva vows. A lot of people in Tibetan Buddhism attend empowerments and ceremonies where the Bodhisattva vows are given and so on. So a lot of people have received the Bodhisattva vows numerous times. But whether they are a Bodhisattva in name only and not truly depends upon how they conduct themselves in terms of lifestyle, actions they engage in, and so on. The same principle applies to all of us who have taken the Bodhisattva vows, perhaps numerous times. In terms of judging whether one is a true Bodhisattva or a charlatan Bodhisattva. Chölam, kan du säga så? So, in order to avoid, or in order to not be a Bodhisattva in name only, but a true Bodhisattva, it means that one, or the true Bodhisattva, engages in the acts of Bodhisattvas. He does what Bodhisattvas are expected to do. And that brings us to the 37 practices of a Bodhisattva. This is what a Bodhisattva who isn't a Bodhisattva in name only does throughout his life. He engages in these 37 practices. Now, in terms of lifestyle, you have two perspectives. What is good to do and what isn't good to do. Namely, what should one as a Bodhisattva adopt and what should one avoid in order not to contradict the path of a Bodhisattva. Now, in terms of what a Bodhisattva does, in order to act as a true Bodhisattva, that is primarily about the actions called the 6 paramitas, the 6 deeds which transcend the ways of the world. The first 5 of the 6 were explained, I think, in the 2 previous sessions. And today we've come to the last and 6th, which is the paramita of higher knowledge, also referred to as the paramita of wisdom. And in the translation, that's number 30 in terms of the 37 practices. Yeah. So in terms of truly living the life of a true Bodhisattva, there are 20 verses in the text that set forth what a true Bodhisattva does. And today's first verse, number 30, is the last of these 20. And that is then followed by 4 verses which tells the practicing Bodhisattva what he should avoid doing in order not to contradict the principle of, or principles of this path, the path of a Bodhisattva.
Tiyinde ta shorka samchu tambatella sherab mena parul singayi jokpe songchup topara minupe songare.
So to begin with, verse number 30 says,
okay, go ahead.
Since perfect enlightenment cannot be obtained through the 5 paramitas without insight, referring to the 5 previous paramitas that have been explained.
Sherab me na parul simbangabo ti jokpe sanje ji kompon tobe yul rog mare songre.
So the 5 previous deeds which, the 5 previous paramitas, by practicing these 5 alone, perfect enlightenment cannot be obtained. It's not possible.
Penna gond shebe jimba dan chutum la so be sherab ritsi masem bate khorbe za jo chando.
So generosity, ethics, and so on, the previous 5, to practice just these 5 deeds without insight makes for or result in good circumstances in worldly existences. The practice of the 5 alone, in the absence of insight, will not bring about the attaining of Buddha, the enlightened state. That's not possible without insight. If we take the example of an act of generosity in the absence of insight,
we
can just take a look around in our world. There are numerous individuals who have immense fortunes throughout the world.
And
the fact that in this life they have immense fortunes is the result of their previous generosity in previous lives. Kanga korve savala droger. Now, in this life, these wealthy individuals may act in a generous way and give quite freely of their wealth for various purposes. Now, some individuals will give freely to purposes of virtue, and others may give freely of their immense wealth to purposes of non-virtue. And that will then determine or be a factor which determines the nature of future rebirths. Now, in the case of someone who gives to good purposes, virtuous purposes, that again will produce a rebirth in good circumstances, whereas, of course, if someone gives freely or is generous with his wealth and give to non-virtuous purposes, that will make for circumstances of suffering in the future. Shantideva said, Didn't Parchin Mara?
That can't Jimba Sutum Karina, the Kandej Char Rogiarsana, launching a tree Javanan Chagre. Launching to the Sawatsi on the Chuganan Zugundoa. Then Chuganan to the sea Sansan, rotated to Chugal turns at the Yemetsi on the Telatorgundoa. Yan tell at the common to the wall pet Sagundoa. Yan Chunuzugunda, then I Chagre.
Shantideva explained what one can expect as an effect of practicing generosity, ethics, and so on without both insight and bodhicitta in the following manner, or by way of the following simile. He said, look at elephants in the wild. Elephants live in hot climates. That's where these animals thrive. And during the hot season, they suffer a lot from the heat. And therefore, they seek out water holes where they can bathe in cooling water. And so they roll around in water holes and then get up feeling refreshed. However, quite soon the freshness evaporates because of the hot sun, and then they with their trunk throw sand all over their bodies. The sand which will, until it dries, give a protective coating that keeps the heat of the sun out. However, once the heat of the sun has made the moist in the sand evaporate, it has the opposite effect. It makes for rashes and again feeling of excessive heat and so on. Like this in the hot season, elephants go from water holes to showering in sand to again water holes to wash off the dried up sand, which makes life difficult, again and again and again, in order to escape the heat of the season, which they suffer a great deal from. And in terms of individuals who engage in generous actions, actions of ethics, patience, and so on, without bodhicitta and insight, the same applies. It will illustrate how they will go from one rebirth to the next, sometimes in good circumstances, sometimes in circumstances of suffering. The endless succession of rebirths in worldly existences cannot be ended, without bodhicitta and insight. That's the point of the simile.
That's awesome. Oh yeah. Tap dancing korsum metok pe sharab gamba jasel ali song.
Therefore, the author continues, cultivating insight which is free of concepts and endowed with threefold purity and skillful means is the practice of a bodhisattva.
That is saying the tap ninja chimbo song. Ninja chimbo said random savanama mipa, yeng dungal sendoji,
The tabla.
Oh.
And with skillful means, or the words skillful means, is a reference to the main theme in Mahayana Buddhism, that of great compassion for others.
Oh, tabtang denshi, korsum mitokpa said that shirab the candidate go yorsana.
And the words endowed with threefold purity are a reference to knowledge of emptiness.
That emptiness is samatang dundu perna, ngaranzole tongu barwa. Ti into.
And in terms of knowledge of emptiness, we as beginner practitioners need some explanations here as to the expression threefold purity.
Jimbachi tangi na.
In the context of emptiness, yes.
Jimbachi tangi na. Tangpo tongse yulte la samastanda. Yul korangone sokpa hungochire mato ranjinji tubachi san merwa. Tendawe yultila mignam ni yuebachi che.
Mignam kare?
Migpa yul jimbatang se pangote che. Namba ko ranjinji matube namba chik. Jimbat Tongapo Gongsa Ngarang.
Lasso?
Latakche Tanda Tik Minam Ia Ranshin Matachil Kotupure.
Reda parol på det rangi me pa ina nayan rangi me bara.
Kotupure. Tele Minam Chik Yungadua.
Da jimpa tang du di nampa de semla korgogen du som
Ja, number to Korgu Yarwa. Don't you know what they antenna since Corbett then? Don't to a Gila, look come to somewhere.
So here the explanation is the following. If we take the example of an act of generosity, you have the recipient, you have the person who is generous, and you have the thing with which he is generous. One may give food to someone, one may give money to someone, whatever is given. So there is the recipient, there is the individual who gives, and what he gives. You have these three things. We can take the example of giving food to a poor person in need of food. As the Bodhisattva practitioner gives food to the poor person, in terms of acting, the Bodhisattva himself should, in terms of his mindset, be able to, on one level or another, or to some extent or another, see the emptiness of the recipient, the poor man he's giving food to, knowing that the person is in question from the perspective of what an individual in fact is. That individual is nothing but a mass of subtle material particles. The body of the person is made up of innumerable subtle material particles, atoms and subatomical particles. And in fact, there isn't a person or an individual at all. In terms of the body of that person, there is just this mass of subtle particles, and each individual particle can be divided into smaller and smaller units in an infinite progression, and therefore there is nothing real about the physical body of the person in question, nor about his so-called mind, because the mind is just a current of vivid and knowing instances of knowledge. So again, there is no real reality there. The so-called individual is empty of a real reality. That understanding the practicing Bodhisattva applies to himself, the giver, because he's just another so-called individual, also having no real reality. So that sort of vision, as it were, in terms of how one sees the situation and the components of the situation, should be at hand while giving. And then there is, in this case, the food that one gives, so that this poor man gets something to eat. The thing one gives is also empty of a real reality. So the absence of a real reality applies to recipient, giver, and what is given. And this is what is meant when with the phrase threefold purity. You have the three major components as to the act of generosity, and all three lack real reality. That's their common denominator. And with that as one's way of looking at the situation and its components, one acts in a generous manner. And that's how generosity with insight is practiced.
And the
same applies to the other 4 deeds in this list of 5. One needs to incorporate both skillful means and threefold purity, meaning compassion and higher knowledge.
And this you could see the can cogious drip labja saying charan jimba tango, chutim song good, song tong and dead and labja to kanga jab song.
So that makes for the section. We've now come to the end of the section, which tells a bodhisattva what he should do as a true Bodhisattva.
Tande menchoge sholoka yege gagplabjat somaje.
In the next 4 verses, that is to say 31 through 34, there is advice in terms of what a true Bodhisattva does not do, what he should avoid.
Te kharadesana rang tulba rang tulba rang ki matana chepe zukje chemin jesikpe song ta ngarang ken.
Here the author begins by saying, if you don't examine your own confusion, you may become a charlatan in the guise of a Dharma practitioner.
Te ta rangi che shuro do chepe zunyin raw chi yedaba yinna yang tene rang tulbate ngara rang ke hakogre mato miking ke hakoya de khapure.
Now, in terms of a practitioner and his possible confusion or delusion or ignorance, however one wants to phrase it, it's really up to the practitioner himself to find out whether he is influenced by confusion or not. He's the only one who can really know, because the confusion is his own. Others can't really tell him the level of his confusion or what he's confused about. He is the best judge himself of his own confusion. Therefore, Buddha Shakyamuni said, each individual has to judge his own confusion. Otherwise, the practitioner may engage in actions that contradict the Buddha Dharma. Here, the well-known Indian Buddhist master Guru Padma Sambhava said, otherwise one risks to be influenced by evil forces simply. And here there is the mentioning of various types of evil forces. Tendang på det?
Det kan kogorsena shorichene. Tepata tanang sambachane meva. Then shonzing jangja chene de devatero lai pui du chebare.
Lai pu da de lodju kan det se.
Lai pui du se den zehi yidong we du sonare ko gambala shimba chemboreda ko chögyule shimba chemboreda sene met sangme töraj tangrwa. Tate du shori chade barwa lote.
Tate så god så min dula.
Perna ngarwa. Ta ngal min Khenpo singe yorwa.
Re.
Ta Khenpo se du nga kaju pe ge chö tele yin tetsam ji yakpo yomar kaju ba yakshö resa. Kaju pe na ne rante gamba yakshö resa. Ta tenre ge samna ta mangpo cher de da du ke rang ju de simi ongre sonje.
Well, there is the first type of evil force, as it were, evil force in terms of one's mindset. And Lai pu den soda de la Shencha Chempora, va?
Yeah.
Yeah. You have the so-called God realms, which we as human beings can't directly see. Even so, there are descriptions of them, where individuals, because of good deeds in the past, are reborn in exceedingly good circumstances, divine circumstances, one would say. And these individuals are, for the major part, extremely attached to their divine circumstances. Their circumstances and the worlds they live in are said to be like what we humans refer to as paradise type of thing. So the first type of evil force is the evil force within, where a person becomes exceedingly attached to, for example, the tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, for example, that he is a member of and which he practices. Khenpo Rinpoche takes himself as an example. It's about thinking in the following terms. Now, he is a Khenpo of the Karma Kagyu school, and he could therefore perhaps have fostered a mindset where he sees the teachings of the Karma Kagyu school as superior to the teachings of other schools in, for example, Tibetan Buddhism. And one sort of gets into this way of thinking to the point where one becomes convinced that one's own tradition is the one and only. Other traditions don't count very much, which is not a good thing from the perspective of what Buddha Shakyamuni taught, namely the Buddha's doctrine. And in consequence of this way of thinking, he may see the main monastery of his, the main seat of his tradition, which in the case of the Indian subcontinent is Rumtek Monastery in Sikkim, that state of that Indian state. He may think, my monastery, the main seat of my tradition, is the greatest of all main seats. And one gets into this way of thinking to the extent where there is the conviction in the end that other traditions and other main seats are inferior to one's own tradition and one's own main seat, or the main seat of one's own tradition, which makes for a great deal of attachment to the wrong kind of attachment to one's own tradition. Namely, an attachment based in a sense of superiority in comparison to others. And this is an evil force within that ruins the mindset of a Bodhisattva practitioner. And this is something one should be very aware of and avoid. This is not to be fostered, this sense of superiority in any context. This type of evil force within one's mindset will bring nothing good, neither in the world nor in terms of the otherworldly or a path to liberation from the world. And that's all for today. We'll continue with explanations of this point next week.